Welcome to Big Closet, Small Planet. My name is Mike Schrager. Today's podcast is part of a special series for the Scandinavian Textile Initiative for Climate Action. The focus is a Climate Action Week. So today we are reconnecting to a topic that we, of course, have been focused on all year long. But last year, during last year's Climate Action Week, we had a theme which was about green growth, overconsumption, and degrowth. And the question was, can sufficient emissions reductions be achieved in the current paradigm? So the idea was that if the fashion and apparel industry can continue to grow through some call a green growth model, is this really doable? And a number of leading thinkers, including those sitting here today with us today, are questioning some of that. And we're going to see what that questioning is. The argument at some level is that to reduce the emissions at the pace and scale required for this industry and to operate within the planetary boundaries, overproduction and overconsumption needs to stop. But it's especially difficult, experts would argue, because the dominant economic business model relies on growth, and business growth usually neutralizes gains in emissions reductions. So we talked about this last year. If this is true, what can we do? And we had a number of presentations, including a update on the report from the Hot and Cooled Institute, Unfit, Unfair, Unfashionable. And we also heard from Luca and Katia, who are now with us today. And so I wanted to check in with them because I know they have come farther in their thinking and work since our last call, to hear about what they're working on today. And so I'd like to welcome both of you. Thanks for being on the podcast. Maybe you both can start by just introducing yourselves to the audience again. Let's start with Katia.
Hi, Michael. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Katia Dayan Vladimirova. I am a chief executive officer at the post-growth fashion agency. And it was my pleasure to do work with ECOS, with Luca, on a report that was recently made public on sufficiency in textile policies.
Great. And Katia, you also, if you could say a little bit about your academic and research background.
Absolutely. For many years, I was a researcher at the University of Geneva and other universities. And by training, I am a political scientist and ethicist working on climate policy. For the past 10 years, I was working in the research space around sustainable fashion consumption. But that cannot be studied in isolation. So I went more into a systemic analysis of the fashion system, not just the industry, including consumption downstream and other dimensions, including social justice and inequalities. But now I focus on the post-growth fashion agency and do my analytics outside of a university framing.
Very good. And Luca, tell us about yourself and your organization.
Thank you, Mike, for having me on this podcast. I'm Luca Boniolo. I'm program manager at ECOS. ECOS is an international environmental NGO that works on environmental protection within policies and standards. And I specifically focus on textiles. We work on, for instance, EU policies focusing on design. You may be aware that indeed there are different policy initiatives that try to regulate how products need to be designed to be placed on the EU market. But I also focus on trying to reduce the sector footprint on the environment throughout the entire value chain. And this work on sufficiency, it's an integral part of our effort to reduce the footprint of the sector and bringing it back within planetary boundaries.
Brilliant. So I wanted to ask what has happened since our conversation during last year's Climate Action Week.
Yeah, Well, from a policy perspective and a politics perspective, many things have happened. We have the new elections in the EU with a new European Commission that set also their new priorities. If the previous Commission was much focused on the European Green Deal, we could say that in this new commission for the next policy cycle will probably prioritize competitiveness and trying to support the industry. We have seen with already some proposals, not really related to the sufficiency topic, but to the due diligence and the sustainability reporting that aiming at simplifying also legislation, and therefore we do think that indeed that will be probably the priority of this new European Commission. On the other side also of the Atlantic, there have been the elections in the United States that also may influence overall the global discussions, and we feel that probably there is indeed a focus more and more on deregulation and potential scaling down of the ambition of environmental protection but we're still here. We do have the new report that Katia mentioned beforehand that we have published in the meantime, and that we are happy to present to you today.
And the name of that report?
Yes. So the report is called Less is More, Taking a Sufficiency Approach in EU Textile Policy.
Got it. So I sort of hear an implication, but I may be reading into things when you presented that, Luca, that some of the political developments will, of course, affect how you talk about this work in a context of apparel and textiles. But let's come back to that and start with some sort of, again, framing so the audience can understand the theory and concepts of all this again. So, Katia, maybe you're the one to do this here. Can you succinctly provide some background on the theory and assumptions around sufficiency and its approach in the textiles or apparel sector?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. It's hard to do it in a succinct manner because obviously there is a historical background to this. There is an evolution of thought that we can trace over the past 20, 30 years. And we can also see how this current very industry/sector specific development can be traced to other, more broader consumption areas, consumption, production, and other parts of human activity. But essentially, sufficiency is about reducing demand on resources, on different services and products that is not really needed, that is not feasible within the planetary boundaries. And I hope that I will not go into discussing planetary boundaries. This is kind of a fixed term that many people have accepted today. So sufficiency is about avoiding demand. And sufficiency is different from another term, efficiency, which has been popular for quite some time. Efficiency is about making processes better, making how we make things more efficient, meaning that you reduce for example, environmental impact per unit of production. You make it more efficient, or you produce it quicker, or you use fewer materials, you save costs. Essentially, it all boils down usually to costs. So efficiency is about improving certain metrics per unit of production. Sufficiency, on the other side, is a different kind of logic. Sufficiency makes us question how much is enough. And right now, in the past decade, we really very clearly heard from scientists who have been talking to us for decades, but finally we heard very clearly and loudly that there are certain biophysical limits, the planetary boundaries, and there are certain limits to our resources that we simply cannot and should not overcome, because then we risk a total collapse of the system. and not just inequalities, but really total collapse of the system. And these limits, they can be interpreted and kind of broken down into specific limitations that we could imagine for certain industries, for certain groups in a society, for how certain, for example, consumer segments are consuming today and how they should be consuming in the future, how certain industries produce, looking at SUVs, for example, and so on. So sufficiency is about limiting the material throughput of the system and essentially reducing the volumes of resources that we extract, use, and waste. Because, frankly, the amount that we use today is absolutely too much. And I'm speaking about the global north. And zooming onto the textile industry, sufficiency conversations were not a thing even 3 years ago in this space. Sufficiency is generally an emerging concept. It is very much aligned with degrowth, post-growth thinking, which is about reducing the size of certain kind of, like cancer in your body. There are certain industries that are like cancer for our planet. They're really, really damaging, producing SUVs or extracting fossil fuels, or fast fashion that relies a lot on synthetic materials. These are industries that have been recognized to do bad for the environment, for the people who are involved. And rather than marginally improving how things are working, what we really need to rethink is, do we really need to continue relying on growth? Because all of the brands, I don't know a single brand, with exception of very, very few smaller brands, who would not plan for growth year after year. And growth today is linked, their growth in revenue is linked directly to the production of new units. And this has been a big problem. It has absolutely exploded the number of units that have been put on the market. So, with the logic of sufficiency, what we wanted to develop in this report with ECOS was, can we even apply this logic of how much is enough? Can we even apply the logic of limits, and not just to consumption, but more importantly to production, to policies, to regulate this field that has been running wild for so long, for a really, really long time? So in this report, we had space to experiment, because this is a very innovative, it's a pioneering take on how sufficiency could look like in policy. And I'm sure there are other, interesting suggestions and proposals that could be added there. We could speak maybe a bit more on the 4 pillars that we have in it, but I don't know if this is a good moment for me to pass the baton to Luca for the next question, or if you'd like me to elaborate a little bit more on the.
Yeah, let's, before you pass it on, there has also been, terminology is used a lot, new terms that maybe some people are familiar with who are in the bubble, and then others who are not. I've also heard the term well-being. You talked about post-growth. How do those relate to the term and the approach of sufficiency, from your point of view?
Absolutely. Imagine 3 blind men describing an elephant. Well, this is about it. It about captures the similarities. I think all of the strands of research with which I am familiar, and I'm following all of them, the well-being economy conversations, how to improve well-being in a society and set well-being as the ultimate goal for societal development, as opposed to GDP, which favors growth at any cost. The degrowth and now post-growth conversations, in which we're speaking about actually degrowing in a smart way by discussion and not by collapse. Our system that has grown too big and too dependent on growth. Sufficiency is a very similar idea, in which we are talking about voluntarily imposing certain limits on ourselves, not to consume and produce too much, not to go over the limit, while, and it's always underlined in all of these lines of thinking, while improving inequalities. We should absolutely try to figure out how to put caps on certain resource consumption, but at the same time, at the same level, we need to consider how to make not inequalities not disappear, but how to try to start evening them out in a more just and fair system.
So let me ask, and I don't know who wants to answer this one, but this is a long conversation about how do you is it a false dichotomy to say if you reduce resource use, if you put a limit on those things in the apparel and textile industry, that you will necessarily be putting a limit on the jobs in the supply chain that a lot of people are relying upon today, younger, more marginalized people who have become dependent on these jobs, even if their situation may not be ideal. Uh, is it just an assumption that we can't have both of those at the same time and need to rethink this particular industry, whether or not it's going to be a bumpy ride or not, or how does the sufficiency approach this issue of people's livelihoods?
Let me take this question. The approach that we took in the report is to try to address market failures. Um, Therefore, we tried to propose policy recommendations that focus on making circular business model more attractive and at the same time reducing the amount of resources that are used within the system. But that does not necessarily mean that we need to decrease the revenue of companies. If those revenue come from a business model that are within the planetary boundaries and that will ensure overall that the volume of materials and resources that are extracted from nature remains within planetary boundaries. So first of all, this is important to highlight also in this political context that we have mentioned before. But secondly, sufficiency is really about ensuring well-being for all within the planetary boundaries. So environmental and social consideration go hand in hand. ECOS is an environmental NGO, so our report focused mostly on environmental policy proposals. However, we felt it was imperative to mention that redistribution policies along value chains are necessary. And this is one of the four pillars that Katia mentioned before. So recalibrating the system towards sufficient levels of resource use goes hand in hand with a just transition. And living wages, reduced working hours, and improved social protection and benefits should be at the heart of the transition. So we do have policy proposals that try to build on the premise that we must ensure a well-being for all and balance any negative effects on, for instance, the orders that brands may buy from manufacturers. And we propose a model where profits are reinvested in local communities and support worker welfare rather than being redistributed to shareholders. And by, for instance, maybe capping top management bonuses linked to sales of volumes or ensuring fair trading practices in the value chain. We are in conversation with NGOs advancing human and labor rights of workers in the textile value chains. They have the expertise on what are the best policies to recalibrate the system. So it's important that they are also part of the discussion about sufficiency. I would also like to add that climate change is already impacting communities in countries that are vulnerable to climate change, and workers in low-income areas of these countries are indeed already the first one to suffer the consequences. So also the status quo cannot really be a solution for the workers, because we are seeing that they are being impacted by climate change as well.
Okay, that's a great nuanced explanation of how you see the social element. Before we jump into the concrete policies that you're proposing, and you alluded to them now, you mentioned this four pillars, and I'm not so sure you got enough time to explain what the full four pillars are. So maybe you can do that so people understand the four pillars that make up the sufficiency approach. Who wants to take that?
I'm happy. I'm happy to take that one, Mike. Um, Before I do that, you asked a really excellent question just before, and just give me 30 seconds to elaborate because this is one that really comes up often, and I want to complement the answer that Luca already gave. I recently had an opportunity after writing this report. I had an opportunity to speak quite closely with people from trade unions, representatives of workers from the global south. And I asked them this question. I asked them this very question. If we are now in the global north campaigning for reducing material throughput, which means reducing the number of units put on the market, how do they see this? Is this really, do they feel threatened by this in terms of losing their jobs? And the answer that I received was actually really enlightening. I didn't expect it, and I want to share it with you. The answer was that our needs in, I was speaking with Bangladeshi garment workers. They said our needs are about earning more, earning money enough to be able to support our livelihoods. This is what we're interested in. We're not interested in producing more units per day, producing more. Yes, we need more income, but this is about income for us and not about the units of production. Right now, in a family of 4 people, 3 people have to work, and sometimes several of these people are children. They have to work because the wages that they earn are so little, they are unable to support the family of four people. So imagine a world in which one person is able to make a living wage and support the whole family, or only 2 people instead of 3 have to work, and one can go, I don't know, to school and study and do other things that children do and are supposed to do at this early age. So for me, it was a very interesting reframing because uh, the workers' perspective is that what they're worried about is their livelihoods, but it's us in the global north we have already framed the issue that the only way that they can get more money is if they produce more units.
I get you. I get you totally, and I think that was super helpful to look at it from a different angle, and it brings up the issue of making the economics work in a way that is fair and provides living wages and beyond for the things we do produce. So thank you for that, Katya. That was a nice clarification. Why don't we jump, and then you can jump back in, both of you, if I've missed something here that you wanted to highlight. But I thought, for the purpose of the listeners who now understand generally the theory and they can read the report, we'll make that available. And if you need to, again, clarify some of the theory that you haven't already, jump in. But I thought maybe it's even easier now to see how you are trying to translate this into concrete policies or practices or actions, so to speak, because often that is where the rubber hits the road for theory to action. So, who wants to give it a shot to say, okay, here's the framing that Katya laid out, and Luca, you complimented, but here's then what this means in terms of actual policy proposals or actions that you want both legislators and stakeholders to take.
I will address those 4 pillars and then pass the mic to Luca because he is on the policy side, a much better expert than I am. So, in terms of framing, we kind of gathered our thinking around 4 pillars of sufficiency policies. The first one is overproduction. We produce too much, and that dimension of the system needs to be regulated in terms of volumes and not weight, but rather units of production. The second pillar is overconsumption. Here we are entering the murky waters of, how and why people consume. Are we consumers or citizens or something else? How do we understand ourselves, and how do we control that point of acquisition, let's say, and how much stuff is being sold and acquired in a society? The third pillar is about overdisposal. Consumers who purchase things that don't even fit into their closets anymore have currently a very convenient system of disposal. So the material throughput of our wardrobes has intensified a lot because we have a very guilt-free and easy way to dispose of things. And these things end up, as many of you know, in not as donations given for free to people in need, but as entering a secondhand trade, and then in countries that suffer from our textile waste. So it's the third pillar. And the fourth pillar, which is kind of transversal, is about social justice. It's about justice within the fashion system and decreasing inequalities. At every one of the first three pillars, there are very strong inequalities in terms of power structures existing, existing lock-ins, and we wanted to address that through policies in our report. So this is in terms of framing, and I think Luca can explain better on the specific policies.
Yeah, thank you, Katia. Very briefly, maybe looking at the first pillar, so overproduction, we have proposals that go from adopting EU legislation on sustainable resource management with clear binding material footprint targets for 2030, 2040, and 50 that covers textiles specifically. And then, also adopting requirements on the design of the products to ensure their durability, their repairability, as well as information on the precise measurement, the month and the year of production, and other information that might be relevant for also the consumer to make an informed choice about what they are buying. But our proposals go also to defining and limiting the number of collections per year and adopting reporting requirements on total production volumes. If we look at the second pillar on, so the focus on consumers, on the other hand, we have proposals such as limiting the advertisement and banning the free returns, introducing education programs, and incentivizing circular business models such as repairs and local reuse through a series of different measures and bonuses and financial incentives. On the third pillar, we focus more on the waste part, and we propose to modulate the fees that are paid by producers for putting products on the market, the so-called EPR fees, also based on how many products they put on the market and not just about the intrinsic quality of the products themselves, uh, and introduce targets for preparation for reuse and waste prevention. And finally, also more stringent end of waste criteria for textiles, also to make sure that indeed we can have a clear separation between what is considerable as a second-hand or used textiles and what is actually just textile waste. And finally, the last pillar, as we mentioned before, social justice, more redistributive policies among the value chain actors. And also, I wanted to emphasize the need that the governments need to provide also for the less affluent consumers that are present in the EU to ensure that they also exercise the right to adequate clothing if they don't have the means to buy the necessary clothing for themselves.
So this is a lot of things that seem familiar and then things that seem pretty new. And maybe I'm getting it wrong, Luca, but when you talk about repair and those kinds of circular business models, at least the stated intention from, for instance, the EU textile strategy is to encourage that. So what I'm interested in here is to know, do you think that there are any aspects of the current legislative proposals that support this sufficiency approach, or are they all coming up short and there's nothing that we can say this is in the right direction or this we support at this point?
Indeed, as you mentioned, it is true that some of our proposals fit into policy initiatives that are currently on the agenda of the EU policymakers. And hence, it may be easier to get some of them adopted. I'm thinking, for instance, of eco-design requirements, or currently the EU is revising the rules on which information needs to be on the label. And ideally, also, the textile strategy should look into circular business model and how to make them more interesting, the repair bonuses, etc. Or even the EPR fees. We were very pleased to see that the final revision that was targeted on the Waste Framework Directive, focusing on textiles, allowed or invited at least member states to set EPR fees that module the fee also based on quantity if they wanted to. So some of our proposals, we see them there in the policy agenda, and some of them might be not currently on the agenda. Nonetheless, we believe that all the proposals that we have in our report are doable. It is more a matter of whether there is a political appetite and leadership to have a long-term vision for the sector. As a society, we can decide that specific products harm our health or the environment, or both actually, in such a way that bold interventions are necessary. In June last year, the UN Secretary General Guterres called on countries to ban advertising by fossil fuel companies, for instance, and many cities now are banning advertising for high polluting companies and products such as fossil fuels. And we can mention The Hague, Stockholm, Edinburgh, among others. So some of our proposal might seem a bit further away from the policy agenda, but they're not impossible. It's really just about the political will and leadership that is needed.
That was interesting to hear that you alluded to or you mentioned banning of advertising, because I thought when I read the report, this one makes sense, but how is this going to get in the current way that we operate? How is this going to get adopted? And so you, as you say, don't feel it's so outlandish to think in this way for the apparel and textile industry. Let me ask you about this idea that I brought up in the beginning about making the economics work. Katia had also talked about, and you, about this issue that in theory, you could still distribute wealth in the supply chain to workers, to partners, without uh, producing or consuming so many resources, actually consuming resources within the planetary boundaries, so to speak. Um, the financial incentives to be able to sort of maintain the economy and the jobs both in the EU and outside the EU, for instance. Uh, have you thought specifically about how the financial aspects of this could work to shift the industry, or is that not yet where you're at?
It is a very important point. Ultimately, we need to make circular business model more profitable, to make sure that there is also appetite to implement them and make them a bigger share in the overall income that is generated by companies. Ideally, all their income should come from this type of models of business models. So how to make it interesting? It really needs to be a policy intervention, because we do think that the market by itself will not lead to a situation that we hope we achieve. And all the different policy measures and policy proposals can have a sort of financial incentive that can be either positive or negative, right? So if we introduce legislation, there could be penalties for those that do not respect or meet the requirements of that legislation. But also more specifically, we do see that, for instance, we would really need to support more the local businesses, the social enterprises, with also some bonuses for all consumers, maybe to repair products, to make it more interesting than buying a completely new product, or VAT reductions, or for instance, also for companies, the EPR fees, so the extended producer responsibility fees, could also work as a disincentive to apply a model that is based on just high volumes of new products placed on the market, and maybe they could rethink and offer services rather than products, to be able to maybe create that customer care whereby you would also prolong the life of products that they have sold in the past. So it's also about the creativity and innovation that companies can have and should have within the limits that we give all together as a society, and that we understand are the limits that our planet has in terms of resource use. So it's also a matter of shifting the revenues from just selling products to also selling maybe a package of product and service, so that you can generate also revenue from the service side of this model.
Right. And I think that that aspiration is very, very right in my opinion. I know that when we work with established traditional companies with traditional business models, again, it's no a big surprise to those who are engaged in this topic that the financial incentives to shift significantly to a circular business model versus a linear model, they say is just not there, because linear, traditional virgin fiber based models are still cheaper to produce than to deliver a circular business model. And if they do a circular business model, it's really a small percentage of their revenue that they're getting, and nothing that can disrupt their model in general. So that sort of idea that we need to really rethink the financial incentives to move it in the direction that you're talking about, I think is probably crucial. And then there's this larger question before we jump into sort of how people are receiving your ideas. I just wanted to go back to Katia and say, is there something here which is we can shift to maybe less resource intensive kinds of models through what we're talking about, ideally with a shift in how we reward or penalize financially, so that the industry can move more wholeheartedly in that way? But are we also talking about in this sufficiency model, as I think you implied in the beginning, that in some cases we may just need to also, no matter how we shift, just say we need to reduce this particular industry's size or throughput uh, just off the bat, that there's only so much we can maybe do with green taxes or green subsidies, but ultimately there's probably a fundamental problem with how much throughput is happening in this particular industry.
Um, yeah, well, we have numbers. The numbers are not extremely rich or reliable in the fashion sphere, unfortunately. I mean, it's estimated that the production volumes are between 80 and 150 billion units per year. I mean, this kind of range in any other industry would give people a heart attack, if you if you are not sure, is it 80 or 150 billion? So it shows how just in what kind of space of uncertainty we are navigating. What we do know and what we do see is that from the disposal side, from the downstream side, from general intensified levels of consumption, we see that just too much is being put on the market, and it's way too much for people to use in the same patterns as we used to even 30 years ago, for the same duration of time. So yes, definitely the throughput is a major problem, but also so is how the system is set up. And really, when you speak about the incentives, I want to be nice. I don't want to be the the kind of the mean girl, calling out things. But to be honest, this really reminds me. It made me think about the fact that only last year or a couple of years ago, the United Kingdom government finished paying retributions to the former slave owners who owned cotton plantations in the Caribbean, and cotton and tobacco plantations. And the idea was that it was up to the government to pay to the slave owners the retributions for the economic value that they didn't make because they gave up their slaves. So to me, there are certain structures in place that are so entrenched, and that we don't even question. What we see right now is that there is very clear evidence of suffering in the upstream, in the supply chains. People are not being paid enough. It's very hard and very long for them to even get to the place where they can have a decent quality of life. Downstream, there's a lot of pollution. There's a lot of, just a very unexpected kind of a very unexpected dump site that's happening in Chile, in Africa, in Pakistan. So there's a lot of things that are very happening very quickly because of this intensified volumes. But the system is built on the structures essentially of exploitation. And why should we be nice and say, oh, let's offer these very nice people who are making so much money, and I'm speaking about very few people, right, of course, at the top, at the expense of very many and the environment. Why should we even think about giving them the incentives, financial incentives to do better? It's about, if we are bold enough to go to the legislation, it should be really, questioning can we structure things in a different way? Can we not allow to produce in a certain way, rather than asking companies nicely to produce better? Can we say no, certain things are just unacceptable, and we will not accept these products on a EU market or on the US market, any other market, and then see how the market responds to this? Because right now we don't have, even the large platforms that exist today and ship in small packages that have just flooded the EU market. These platforms, even today, yes, there is legislation, but are they following it? Not really. We're not even sure. The tests of clothing that arrives shows formaldehyde, shows a lot of violations of even existing laws and regulations. So I say, in this proposal on the sufficiency, I say we should aim big. And yes, people will, call us dreamers, and they will say, no, this is not realistic. But at least we're talking about this today. We haven't been talking about this 2 years ago. What can happen in 5 years? Maybe, it could go beyond our wildest dreams, and certain structures can be dismantled.
Very good. So let me wrap us up with a very practical question, which you just mentioned. How are people, legislators, practitioners responding to this proposal so far? Because, as you say, it's as I see it, it's a mix of things that have been lifted up in maybe a traditional paradigm of the new textile strategy, which is not so traditional in the sense it's trying to emphasize repair and longer life and durability. But there are then things that, as you mentioned, Katia and Luca, that are maybe pushing the paradigm or beyond the paradigm. How are people responding? Are they saying your proposals are realistic and doable? Are they shocked? Tell me what experiences you've had there.
Yeah, so it really depends on the stakeholder, right? That you're talking to. Many, I mean, I think that everybody is aware that based also on the EU effort, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emission, and the objective of having the climate neutrality, net zero by 2050 in Europe is still very valid. So everybody understands that goal. I think that maybe some of the stakeholders believe that we can achieve that target just by having efficiency gains as Katia mentioned before. So basically improving the emissions per single product. So reducing the emissions that are needed to produce one single product. Our problem is that, yes, but if we still increase the overall volume, we can reduce the emission per product as much as we want, but we still have too much. So I think that there is part of the stakeholders that in the political spectrum that first want to see how these efficiency focused policies that EU is looking at within the textile strategy will the results that these policies will have overall. We think that these two policies need to go in parallel. On the other hand, we need to address the hotspot in the value chain, of course, with the products that are produced, but at the same time, we have the feeling that that will not be sufficient to address the impact that the textile sector has in a sufficient way to bring us back within the planetary boundaries. So yeah, some stakeholders I feel that are more receptive, and others are more in a let's see first what the policies that we have on the table will have as a result, and we will talk about those later. But we are not defeated, and since we do think that some stakeholders and policymakers have our back and are more sensitive to the discussion, we continue our effort.
And I was thinking a little bit about sort of the new attitude regarding competitiveness in the EU, for instance. That is this something that's going to undermine the push now for competitiveness and the clean industrial deals and those sorts of things? Maybe make it challenging to have this kind of conversation. Often language is important, isn't it? How you frame things, and that's how the EU at least is framing things. Any thoughts on that?
So sustainability and competitiveness do not necessarily go one against the other. The important is that if we want to support the competitiveness of the industry, we do not undermine the ambition that we set ourselves or that is needed to um, bring us back and ensure within planetary boundaries and ensure that the Earth will be able to survive. So what we want to make sure of is that whatever framing that we have on competitiveness is still taking into consideration all the different aspects that are relevant when it comes to sustainability, and indeed try to shift the narrative from, oh, if we have to focus on sustainability and regulation, then this is just a cost. No, it's not just a cost. It's also about trying to be creative and innovating within the limits that we have to set ourselves to be able to have a long-term vision that is also sustainable for the future generations. And I think that, creative businesses will be able to thrive. And I think that we need to have a systemic, probably also, way of looking at the society, because companies that do not want to change or maybe do not want to consider the changes that are needed also to be able to be competitive in a sustainable way, maybe for them it might be indeed difficult to continue as they are. But it's really also about innovation of the business models and trying to change, and therefore maybe overall for one business that does not survive, there will be others or other actors in the value chain that do different things besides just maybe selling new products, that will be able to thrive. So I think that it's important to have also a broader vision of the economy, and not just focus on that specific companies that maybe sell just more and more products.
Katja.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, I also wanted to add, probably your main audience here is interested in the EU level conversations that are relevant to the industry. However, I wanted to highlight that there's an overlooked policy dimension here that could have a really important impact. And this one comes from city level policy. Which is, kind of not really the national or international discussion tables, is not really invited. But cities have an immense power as commerce hubs and the hubs for consumption and disposal to transform their local patterns through their policies. And in this slide, I was really pleased to see just a few days ago, London published its textile action plan. Yay! It's following the footsteps of very few cities, including Amsterdam. Amsterdam was a pioneer. And in the London Textile Plan on how to transform its industry and consumption and disposal patterns locally, there is a word: sufficiency. Very clear word, and very clearly, the measures of asking how much is enough and is it really too much? Can our city handle this much throughput? I was so happy to see it in there because it was like, yes, it reached the right ears.
It reached the right ears. Wonderful to hear that they have this on their agenda. Perfect. Both of you, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and for your hard work in trying to rethink how we do this, how we address these very, very difficult challenges. So well done, and I hope more and more people will read your report. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael, for the invitation.
Thank you so much.